Hi, everybody. I'm Scott. Thanks for joining me again today for another episode of the podcast in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier. And today, I got a deep business dive for you. We're going to get deep into the weeds and take a look at what happens. And you can apply this to any other business or to a sports team or anything of the sort. What happens when you bring in bad chemistry and how it affects everything throughout an organization, whether that person is at the top, as in this case, or at the bottom. And what I'm talking about in the case of the Evans Fur Company is the time they brought in the first non-Meltzer CEO to lead the company. And over the course of 6 months that rocked the entire organization, it was an utter fucking disaster. And I don't know any other way to put it other than that. In the middle of 1990, David Meltzer was ready to retire from the Evans Fur Company, and he wanted to go and ride off into the sunset and just pull the strings a little bit from afar. He wasn't yet ready to hand the reins over to his son, Robert. And so for the first time in Evans history, he reached from beyond the corporate stable and looked for somebody outside of the Evans fur and even the fur industry orbit in order to lead the company through its next phase. Now remember, this is also at a time when Pat Regan, the CFO of the company, has masterfully maneuvered some financial deals to get the company refinanced, to have a secondary stock offering in which the Meltzer family and many of the people who own stock in the company did very well, and to give the company a lifeline when it looked as though there might be none.
Well, it had a couple of really solid years prior to me coming on. I think the cold blast that I think happened in '85 really pushed the product quite a bit. Plus, what was really interesting is the affordability of furs was attainable by more people. You didn't have to wait to get married and have a husband who buy you a fur. More women were working, and they could basically buy their own furs. And the company grew wildly. I mean, all the lease departments are expanding. They opened own stores, like in San Antonio, Phoenix, all these locations, which did remarkably well in their first couple of years of being open. And when I got there, it was pretty solid. I mean, it had, 2 lines of credit, one with Continental Bank, and the other one was American National, neither of which exist any longer, and also a term debt with Prudential, I believe it was. And everything was fine. They raised a lot of money during the IPO. David got a lot of money because he sold a lot of his shares. So things looked pretty good. And then things changed.
So about when did you notice that the change?
Well, there were more factors outside the company that were a hindrance, and that was the stock market crash in '87, where it was in October. It was right before the season started. And nobody was spending any money. So all the product we had, we really underperformed. So we were struggling. Then after that, they opened a store in Atlanta, opened another one in Dallas somewhere. I forget, but we were too much of a growth pattern without the real notice that it was going to continue to grow. And we thought locations would make sales, and that's not the case. It's the customers make the sales. You just have to be fortunate enough to be there.
And what David Meltzer ended up doing was reaching down deep into the heart of Texas. And there was a company called The Fair in Beaumont, Texas, who had been led through a similar type of necessitating turnaround by a guy named Leonard Levey. And David Meltzer reached out and brought Leonard Levey into the company. And what would ensue over the next 6 months until Leonard Levey was summarily dismissed come about Christmas time was complete and utter chaos, dissension, and a sense of the company being rocked from its foundation, felt through by all the employees from top to bottom. And that's what we're going to look at today is Leonard Levey and the 6 months that shook the Evans Fur Company. And I don't see any way to start other than to put it in the couple of few words by Ken Levy, who was one of the first salon and store managers for the company in many locations.
Like the people that took over, when the Meltzers weren't there anymore, like Dean, you remember Dean? Everybody was just such milquetoast.
Do you remember him? Eric Zacks?
Oh.
What about Levy, Leonard Levy?
Oh, yeah, Leonard Levy. Yeah, but he was only there a short time.
We finally got a deal done in, I'm going to say, July of 1990. And then what happened was the Kuwait War started and another crash in uncertainty. All this uncertainty makes people not spend money.
Yep.
So we had to work our way through that. But after that, then there's a lot of other things in it. Federated filed bankruptcy.
Satellites.
That was the Houston outfit. Yep. We never got all our money for that because they kept the receipts. Actually, Federated stuck by us. They said, well, we need vendors. So they did continue to pay us. And then when it got real bad, we came up with this plan we got to go negotiate all these leases over. And we came up with this idea of a 5 and 10. That is, we pay 5% on furs and 10% on storage. And they stuck with us because they needed us. They couldn't have anything empty there. They needed people. So that worked out. They finally came out of bankruptcy, I think, in 92. Then Macy's went in. Even though we weren't doing business with Macy's, this whole tumult of retail just changing by the minute just was difficult.
My cousin Robert Meltzer goes on to talk about how he wasn't ready to be the CEO. He didn't even know if he wanted to be the CEO at the time Leonard Levy was brought in to lead things, and how he thought that experiment ended up, as well as why he didn't want to be the guy at that moment. Now, remember, again, coming out of a tough time when Patrick Regan has navigated the company through a very difficult financial complex web of a situation that the company came out of on the other side. And so the last thing that was needed at that point was somebody like what David Meltzer reached out to bring in.
I didn't really want to take over as CEO. I was perfectly comfortable as GMM, which was where my strength was. And I think the only thing that motivated me to want to become CEO is that we had Pat Regan was the CEO, and the only participation that he had in the business was financial. So I guess in some ways it irritated the shit out of me that he would sit in his office and read the Wall Street Journal every day. But obviously, in hindsight, I would have preferred never to have taken over that job because it was a thankless job. And regardless of who was going to be CEO, the company was not going to survive. It may have survived a little longer with Pat because he had the relationship with lenders.
Bob was really good. There was just so much to do. When we had to get into this turnaround mode, I had more experience in that. And I don't want to say I took over, but people looked at me to say, what do we do? Because being in the business as long as Bob and David had been, why do you fire the people you already hired? How do you fire Earl Carr? What do you do with Barry Novick? Those are hard decisions, especially when you're so close. It was really family.
All they knew was up for 25 years. So.
Yep. Right. And it was, I don't want to say it was bloated, but it was too large for where we were going.
It wasn't only David retiring and installing Robert. They went sort of at, us being the world's largest retailer of furs. I mean, granted, we were in the retail industry. However, we were a very specialized, region of the retail industry. And I think Evans' success was based on the fact that when you looked at the people running the company, they were involved in the industry. They knew the industry front and back. The industry, doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand the fur industry. Raccoons go with raccoons. Coyotes go with coyotes. Until the raccoons and the coyotes start mating, you basically have, once you've figured out the raccoon fur, you've got an understanding of the industry. I think that we were sort of reaching, and, we started bringing in people not from the industry. You had Leonard Levey, you had Eric Sachs, and they were also promoting from within the company. But we were a pretty widespread company where we had ready-to-wear as well. Those ready-to-wear people did not understand furs. And again, being a highly specialized industry, we were more than just a retailer. We ended up going from a hands-on, management position to being, looking at a book and looking at reports without looking at, the fur itself. So I think that became our biggest demise, when the leadership of the company was taken out of the hands of the people that knew the product.
I'm Michael Idless, and this is Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier, Part 2. So let's review. We have Rose Walcove being sold to Julius Meltzer when still a spinster at age 29. They're coming to America first class, on the backs of her wealthy Trans-Siberian Railroad engineer brothers. Rose's depression sending her reeling and eventually to bed, to stay. Julius can't support the family, so oldest sons A.L. and Herman leave school to go to work. Oldest daughter Thelma is sent to finishing school to learn to care for them all. Brother Herman assists Brother A.L. and his wife Minerva in the startup of Evans Furs, only for Herman to go into a slow, lifelong depression, clearly a result of the lack of parenting from Rose and Julius. Brother-in-law Harold Sussman and his wife, oldest daughter Thelma, are sent to Boston to expand the company east. Thelma never forgives her brothers for the move away from the family. And let's not forget A.L.'s son David. Oh, David, the crown prince who would wear the crown alone in his own personal cocoon that he himself created. Loved by those who worked for him, admonished by family for his selfish and narcissistic ways. Along the way, a fur company empire is built, and the Meltzers thrive while at the same time suffering the consequences of their parents' abandonment as tragedy checks in for an extended stay. As we recounted, from the moment they began selling squirrel scarves in 1929, Evans Furs seldom knew from tough times. What A.L. Meltzer had hit upon was growing and growing, and the business kept moving forward. Which leads us to part 2, and the term, when you get to the top of the highest peak, there's only one direction you can go.
I think that I've learned a lot, in business school. I learned a lot about management and succession planning and, best practices as they relate to governance and things like that. And one of the things that I was struck by is that there were assumptions made that someone was going to inherit the throne. And I don't know how thoughtful it was. And frankly, I don't know how much was invested in really understanding what the next generation needed to be successful. And I think that there was just, David was ready. He was done. He was tired. And I think that as it got harder, he was less motivated. It wasn't as gratifying to him. So of course he passed the baton. I don't think the company was ready for succession. I don't. And if it was, I think there should have been a more thoughtful process in terms of just in terms of really analyzing direction. Again, I don't know what went on behind the scenes.
I can remember when I first went into the fur division, and there were just some very old thoughts in people's minds. And I'm not going to name the person, but he came into my office and he said, "Sharon, I have a great idea. I'd like your opinion on it." I said, "Yeah, okay." He says, "What do you think about taking a pair of leather pants and putting fur on it?" And I looked at him and I said, "Where are you putting the fur?" If your mind's going the same place mine is, I'm thinking, "Are you out of your mind?" But I said, "Where are you thinking of putting the fur?" And he says, "Well, I'm thinking of putting it on the side of the pants." And I said, "Well, I don't think that, no, I don't think so." So it's not like it wasn't a good thought to do leather pants. Not that the fur division needed to do that. That's something that was probably being done at the time already in the apparel division. But so it's not that their thoughts weren't quote unquote young, but he thinks he has to put fur on leather pants. And I'll never forget that ever in my life. I have a great idea. What do you think about putting fur on leather pants? And I thought, oh my God. I said, "Please tell me where you want to put the fur." So, that's the kind of attitude. And I'm not saying it was that about everything, but that was the attitude of the Furriers. It was just very old school.
I think it was a lot of the anti-fur, and I think that we weren't really watching. I think it was a couple years there was no business. It was too warm. You weren't doing any business, and I think that the whole thing was, we had so many people come in, and so many people you fired that it was really the people that was. We really didn't know until maybe a couple years before that we didn't have any money. Until Pat was saying, we can't pay this. We can't get the money from the people, the banks anymore. We gotta do some business to pay the banks. They don't trust us anymore. And I think that the apparel business was not what it really was at one time. And I think everything went down. And I think that, if you got to pay somebody $300,000, that's a lot of different merchandise. And I think that it was mismanaged because you had Robert in charge, you had Pat Regan in charge, you had Leonard Levey in charge, you had all these different people that were, in charge, and I think there was too many people up in the top mismanagement that weren't really fur people or apparel people.
Those Meltzer kids obviously weren't taught how to cope or how to parent or relationship skills were really lacking, and that got passed down.
DNA really plays a role in any, in anyone's well-being, physical and or mental health.
All I know is that he had a photographic memory. He was brilliant, and the family loved him. Everybody in the family loved him, and it was an absolute shock.
I think she loved the way I looked, so she was always, like I was her little doll. She loved, but she was very interesting and fun and vivacious.
All of his grandchildren wrote reports on Nuremberg at some point in school. Someone would always have an assignment, interview some relative about something.
Nonchalantly would toss a question out, and the beads of sweat were pouring off as he's trying to answer Uncle Bernie's question.
A lot of people live in fear that, oh my God, is that going to happen to me? So if they get depressed and they don't have the tools to handle their depression, what is their model?
In the end, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of customers got hurt because their coats weren't there. And, it was just a bad thing. Just a bad thing.
You can't save your business just by firing people. They fired me. I couldn't believe they fired me. Not for nothing, we were supposed to be life. You know what I mean? We were following, that suit.
And he asked these guys a bunch of questions, and then he threw this dinosaur. I'll never forget it. He threw this toy dinosaur on the table, and he says, "This is what Evans is." And you know what happened to these dinosaurs?
He didn't want to be associated with the failure. And I think that he just wanted to detach, because that wasn't what the legacy that he wanted for himself.
He didn't want to wake up and smell the coffee, so he just, he did the things that he enjoyed doing. Especially people who were in the finance side, they were dealing with trying to put out fires every single day and trying to get enough money into the business to be able to pay the bills.
It was a very unique era of launching new product, of what turned out to be the youthquake, a youth boom, all kinds of innovation, new music, new everything.
That is their legacy, and it's tragic. And these were people's lives and livelihoods. I remember when the stores closed, and, Jeff and I got some calls, and people were just sobbing.
As things fell apart, that also became obvious. Well, they shut the doors on people. That was pretty high profile. Evans, until the end, was high profile and highly regarded.
Because I remember talking with my father, telling him about my job and everything, and he was like, well, you're not a family member, so, just remember that. Always remember that, he would say.
There was tremendous camaraderie. While there was all this strife and all this stuff coming from the top and from the Meltzer family, from my family, there was also this amazing, committed group of general managers and executives.
A fish has got to swim and an eagle's got to soar. That's their natural temperament and how they want to live and how they want to play. And when that's blocked, people are really unhappy.
So what I did is when we got into trouble with the lenders, I told David, we need to bring in a turnaround guy. And I brought this guy in. His name was Gil Osnes, and I worked with him when I was at a prior company, Barbara Green, and he helped me restructure that business. And I said, we need somebody to look over our shoulder and challenge us to do this stuff. And that's how the board hated that.
Oh, yeah.
They thought what were people in the company's resistance to him? Because I have a lot of people on tape commenting negatively about him too.
What was the resistance?
Yeah, from like the people in the departments and the managers because everybody says Leonard Levy and Gil Osnos in the same breath, so they're not,
No, totally different.
Okay.
Well, I'll say this. Gil thought we ought to hire somebody with more of a broader department store kind of background. I disagreed with that. He supported Leonard to be hired, which I totally disagreed with. After it started blowing up, when he and I had that difference of opinion and he yelled at me, that's when they came in and said, this guy's kind of a mistake, because it bared out. So
what's the board saying to you during all this? Harold Sussman and Ernie Wish, and what are these people saying to you?
Not much. They just let me report.
Okay.
A lot of the board guys just fled. Some of the guys who were on the board, I forget their names right now. One guy was a banker. I forget his name. But they abandoned ship. They just left us. Ed Sakala, who was on once before, came back on because I asked him to. And he says, the only reason I'm doing this is because you're asking me. Because he knew what we had to do. I mean, some of these other guys were bankers and lawyers, and what do they know about running retail other than listening about it?
There were too many shiny objects. There was the last shiny object I recall before I left the company was this consultant, who came in and was like, whose word was God, right? Whatever he said was his word. He was just an opinion. And I remember him interviewing me to see if I should work in the business because I took a sabbatical to finish business school. And, he didn't ask me anything about my work, he didn't look at my history. He didn't look at the profit margins I achieved. He was just, it was so glaringly wrong. And again, the fact that he was the final word and he wasn't just a vote, he was the person who made that decision as to which job to offer me when I finished business school and wanted to come back.
I never liked Leonard Levy. Nobody did.
Nobody did.
And it was interesting. We were given his dossier because some headhunter provided it. And one guy wrote a scathing report about him. This guy's got a mercurial attitude sometimes. And boy, did he. This was in 1990. I had just secured the loan. David hired Leonard Levy. And he said, well, if the lenders don't, this is after just getting this loan done. with him not knowing anything about what had happened. He said, well, we'll just file bankruptcy. I go, what are you I go, I said, you're out of line. And he yells at me and says, you're out of line. I stormed out of the meeting. I went up to my office. Remember Bill Cozile?
Yep.
He must have seen my head on fire. And I go, that man's going to ruin this company. With that attitude, you just don't go in and say, I know better, because you don't know shit. Sorry for the expletive there.
No, that's okay.
Anyway, he calls David and the board, and they say, I want to fire Regan. And the board comes in and he says, nope. If anybody goes, it's you. And we knew this was going to happen because the guy, he was so insulting to most of the employees. Like he hated Bob McGrath. The only person he left alone was Bob Meltzer. Because, Leonard just played with the apparel, left Bob alone to handle first. So he didn't bother him at all. Anyway, it came to a head and he got fired by Christmas time.
And Leonard was a smart guy. He knew the retail business. He didn't really try to, it was a combination of things. I don't know that he really tried to learn the idiosyncrasies of the fur business. And I also don't think that the people in the company in the fur side of the business gave him the respect that he probably deserved for his knowledge of retail because he hadn't come from the fur side.
I was in New York when Leonard Levey was there. So I never really spoke to him. I never really had any sort of talking to him or be around him. They more or less kept me away from him for some reason. I don't know why. But, but I know that he was a nasty son of a bitch, is what Sharon was told me all the time, that he was really a nasty guy. But he was, he was like a Ricky or a Sethman, old school coming in, trying to straighten things out, but it didn't. I think it was too far gone when he came there. I don't think he was going to make any difference. I think it was a lot of the anti-fur. And I think that we weren't really watching. I think it was couple years, there was no business south. It was too warm. You weren't doing any business. And I think that the whole thing was, we had so many people come in and so many people you fired that it was really the people that was, we really didn't know until maybe a couple years before that we didn't have any money. Until Pat was saying, we can't pay this. We can't get the money from the people, the banks anymore. We gotta do some business to pay the banks. They don't trust us anymore. And I think that the apparel business was not what it really was at one time. And I think everything went down. And I think that, if you got to pay somebody $300,000, that's a lot of different merchandise. And I think that it was mismanaged because you had Robert in charge, you had Pat Regan in charge, you had Leonard Levey in charge, you had all these different people that were, in charge, and I think there was too many people up in the top mismanagement that weren't really fur people or apparel people. I have a story. I was told a story when I first went to BC that they were going to hire Alan Seifer to be in charge of our fur business. And they had the whole deal all worked out, and David came in and said, no, I'm not doing this. We're not doing that. And they were friends. He says, David, we can be friends, but I'm done with you. I can't deal with you. And they had a deal that he was going to come and run the company. And he had a very good relationship with a lot, he had a big company himself. And, there was a couple different times when I'd be in the fur market and somebody would say that that we were being there was going to be, at one time, Chris and Robert had a meeting where we were going to join companies at one time. And it ended up that Robert threw a wrench in the deal and said, no, we're not doing it.
Look, business has changed so much. The nature of business and how things got done. AL was a screamer. People can't scream anymore. People can't do that anymore. Those days, that's so archaic, that kind of management style. But that's what David knew. David knew because that's who taught him, was someone who screamed and yelled and berated people. And so he thought, gee, okay, I don't even know how he ever vetted this guy. I mean, just because he'd had this success in Texas, what made him think that he could come in and turn this place around? It was so much more than what he was trying to do. And also, I believe Leonard Levy really disliked family members.
Yep.
Scott.
Yep.
I think he came in with a bias. And, I think that, clearly, the record shows, the record speaks for itself, but he really just was opposed to the whole notion of family being involved in the business.
I'll never forget the first time I met Leonard Levy. I was the general manager of our Robinson's operation out in Los Angeles, overseeing 17 stores, one of the company's largest divisions. And the general custom when executives from Chicago came in from out of town was for us to convene and get together and just go over one more time our notes about what we wanted to discuss with Robinson's management when we went upstairs. And David Meltzer was trying to retire and, go enjoy the riches that he had made and the success he had. And he couldn't do it because things were going downhill even before he left. And the succession was not set up properly. He just anointed his son as CEO, and he pitted people against each other before he left. And the environment, it was just not a good environment going into a wartime scenario. And so eventually they hired this guy from the outside, Leonard Levy. And here's my experience with Leonard Levy. So I'm back in LA on my second go round. Now I'm in charge of all of the Evans First Salons at J.W. Robinson's, which is 15 or 17. I forget how many. And Leonard Levy, this new CEO who replaced David and replaced my cousin Robert, was coming in for his first visit to my stores. And he was supposed to come in and get me, and I would escort him upstairs for a meeting with Robinson's management, as was always customary. Well, I'm looking at my watch, and the time goes, and there's no Leonard Levy. And, this is before the days of cell phones. So, if you couldn't find somebody, you couldn't find somebody. 20 or 30 minutes later, I'm sitting in my office, and this guy walks in. He kind of storms into my office, asks the people up front, "Where's Scott?" They send him right back. And he walks into my office, and he puts out his hand. And he goes, "Scott, Leonard Levy." And I stood up and I shook his hand, and I was taken aback a little bit. And I said, "I thought we were going to go upstairs for this meeting." And he said, "Oh, I just came from upstairs." And let me tell you something. If I had to guess, I would say that these people here at Robinson's, they don't like you very much. I really tried hard my whole time at Evans not to use my family connections. And it was hard because a lot of times it could have been very easy to do so. But this time I picked up the phone and I called David Meltzer immediately. And I'm sure he could feel the steam blowing out of the top of my head. And that was my experience with Leonard Levy.
I was upset. They said, when you're hired, we're going to give you the spending account. I go, "What's that for?" "Well, take a friend out to dinner and say it was a customer." I go, "I can't do that. I'm not going to do that." And they said, why? I go, I just don't, I'm uncomfortable. I would never do it. Why should I start now? And then I canceled all those because everybody had them. All the fur guys, all the man. I don't know if people, store managers, but buyers, and they had all this stuff. I go, no, that's going to stop.
Yeah, no, I was a divisional. I had it. I went out whenever I wanted to.
So Leonard Levy, he dove down deep, and he says, I want to see everybody's expense accounts. And I go, uh-oh, this is not going to be fun. He had a pretty good approach to the apparel side, I thought, but he was over challenging everybody. If you disagreed with him on anything, you were a piece of, you know what? And he got into this thing where we had to do this jewelry thing. I don't know. Do you remember adding jewelry?
I think I remember that because I was out in LA. So,
yeah. So, but everybody was against it because your loss factor is huge. Is that how you just sell more? Well, I think the shrinkage was like 15%. Things would break. You know, you have to mount this stuff on that. So that was something. He was reaching for something to say, hey, look what I did. And it didn't have to be done. Then he wanted to bring in this guy, this designer called Kasper. I don't know if you ever heard of that.
Remember that?
And he wanted to brand level. Let's get the Kasper brand. You know, we'll be the exclusive. And everyone's going, no one knows who Kasper is. Well, he did because he's this top level cerebral merchant. So you call.
We finished the year and Leonard Levy's there and we're doing planning. And Craig O'Malley's there, of course, because he's my divisional. And Leonard Levy said, well, tell me, you know, there seems to be some discourse about what transpired in Indianapolis that, you know, Craig feels you could have made a lot more money by doing what he had said. And I'm like, well, Craig sent out the email to all 3 locations. The other 2 managers did exactly what Craig said. And they, instead of a $100,000 corporate contribution, one had a negative and one had like a $10,000 positive. I didn't do what he said, and I made target. Now, who do you want to follow?
Sharon Bass has an interesting and somewhat different take on the Leonard Levy experience. She was working over in the Arctic Dream contemporary fur division at the time. Arctic Dream was a group of Evans stores that we opened around Chicago, trying to sell lower end, more contemporary, more youthful, more playful types of furs and leathers. And she was tasked, when Leonard Levy first came into the company, to go around to all of the Chicago stores with him and give him a look at things and give him the ability to figure out how he wanted to go forward, thus running the company.
So we were always going to the stores. He would ask me a million questions about Arctic Dream, but then, you know, we would then go to visit Evans stores. And the only store that there was an Arctic and an Evans is, like I say, at Woodfield. So that wasn't easy. He says, I'd like to go to a few other Evans stores with you. You know, can we do that? I said, well, I'm supposed to go everywhere with you. So whatever you want me to do, I'll do. And so we went to other stores and he would ask me, he knew obviously that my background had been apparel before then. So he knew that I knew a lot about apparel. And he'd say to me, do you like the way these stores look? I said, I'd like them to look like Arctic Dream stores now. But there's been, you know, it was when Evans was starting to run low on cash. So there wasn't any money to do any remodeling. The stores Evans was still a very strong force at that time, but they didn't want to, there just wasn't money for remodeling. It just wasn't there. And if they were going to put anything into any stores, very honestly, it was going to be Arctic Dream, because Arctic Dream, at the beginning at least, was doing very well.
We're doing planning, and I'm still sitting there with Leonard Levy, and Craig goes, so he asks Craig, well, you know, what's your budget? What's this? And he goes, well, why do you think you're going to be doing so much more business? And Craig goes, well, we're going to do a hotel sale and we're going to do $800,000. And Leonard says, well, how are you going to do that? What'd you do last year? And he goes, $450,000. And Leonard goes, so why do you think you're going to do so much more? And he goes, well, we're going to do better targeted advertising. We're going to increase advertising expense. And Leonard goes, well, what'd you do the year before that? He goes, 550. And what'd you do the year before that? 650. And Leonard goes, so you're going down every year $100,000 about, or 20%. And because you think spending more money is, you're going to do $800,000? He said, did you spend more on advertising between the 550 and the 450? And Craig goes, yeah, why? So Leonard had a few more words for Craig, and I'm sitting there trying not to laugh. But that's how decisions were being made. It was like, well, if we spend more money, we'll get this. Not, we're going to do a better job buying. We're going to work on a better margin. We're going to work on this. Here's our plan. This is the customer we're going after. This is a growth area. There was none of that.
He traveled with me to all of the Arctic Dream stores because I was doing Arctic Dream. And he would ask me, I mean, I was with him days on end. And he would then he have meetings with the Furriers. And he wanted me in on these meetings. And I remember he wanted to go, we were in one of the malls and he wanted to go into a kids store. But he says, I need like some toys. And one of the things that he bought was a dinosaur. And he asked these guys a bunch of questions. And then he threw this dinosaur. I'll never forget it. He threw this dinosaur, toy dinosaur on the table. And he says, this is what Evans is. And you know what happened to these dinosaurs, don't they? And I thought he was a very bright man as far as I was concerned. And especially how he would make comparisons on things.
Again, it was something that was too little too late, because while it could have been a really, really good idea, the company didn't have the financing to develop it. And the other problem with it was totally seasonal. You needed to get into something, because the idea was, well, maybe we should do bathing suits in the summer. Well, you can't, that wasn't, it was done without having a great deal of thought as to how you were going to sustain a year-round business. And again, if you could do enough business in the fall and winter season, it makes sense. It was an idea is again casting straws to try to come up with an alternative on a low budget to the traditional Evans format.
Early 90s were really starting to get intense. And, I was a young kid, right? I was in my late 20s, mid 20s, whatever. And most of the people that I was hanging out with, they were like, what are you doing in that fur business? That's old, grandma business. It's we're not into that. What are you doing in that? I knew that it wasn't going to be the place that I was going to, have a career for 20 or 30 years. I just started to feel like there was too much pressure, cultural pressure, friend pressure, seeing people, that were picketing our sales. That started to happen. And that was pretty intense. We would have, we'd hire security guards. We had to hire police officers at one point. And I saw many times where we dragged people out of the store.
The rise of PETA and the thought of animal rights is what put Evans out of business. And Evans was simply the last one standing. I think that PETA was simply that committed to us being gone, and powerful. And women, the thought of getting a can of paint thrown on your coat while you're walking down the street was intimidating. It was simply a larger societal movement that the industry had no capacity to fight.
I think there was a certain arrogance and hubris about that we somehow could wait this storm out and that we were bigger and that it didn't matter, that somehow it didn't matter. There were signs of what was going on a long time before it blew up and became so big and so messy, and we ignored it. And also in New York, it was scary to walk down the street in a fur coat. So it's not like it was subtle, and we should have thought about diversifying, even if we laid low in the fur business, and if we were going to wait out this storm, if it was temporary, if it was a temporary trend, why didn't we diversify?
Everybody was in business. Nobody was in business to sell the greatest thing. Everybody was in business to sell the most for the most money, to make a living, to do well. Yes, they had to have a good product. People have pride in their product because it sold. But I don't think I used to go to these fur shows and look at the people. You're talking about when these people. Most of the furriers were like, I shouldn't say, had no taste. Were schleppers, and these were the people leading the fashion industry. But I think some of these guys, this is way before your time, that were so bad. You think, and this is the fashion industry. These are the guys. Then there were the fancy guys, but there was no reason it should be the fanciest, the fanciest product. It was a commodity to sell. And I'm sure you had pride in your product, for sure. But basically, you were trying to develop products, if they were up here, to be the umbrella to sell all your stuff.
If you look at it from a macro viewpoint, and I was thinking about this after our last interview, when I started at the company in 1976, I started in the third floor fur salon. That fur salon was run exactly the same way as in 1955. It was like stepping back into a time machine. The third floor had not been remodeled since the 60s, maybe the 50s. You had Miss Ginger was at the desk, and she controlled the floor, what was going on. And Miss Ginger was having an affair probably with Sam Mellon, and you had the next person up, and people took individual customers. That just is a way of business that doesn't exist anymore. And even with things like when I came in, the first 7-8 years, everything was done manually in the company. Here you had a business that was doing, $175-200 million in retail fur business, and every stock ticket had to be handwritten. And it was such a cumbersome way of doing business because the guys who were running the business really didn't give thought to trying to look into the future. They were really just building on what my grandfather had set up in 1948.
I don't know how to sum up how this whole thing went. It was a really stressful, divisive time with this person coming in and trying to drive a wedge into pretty much everything that had been part of the foundation of this company for dozens of years. I, as I said, was in Los Angeles running Evans Robinson's division at the time. I was lucky and fortunate to only have to deal with him over the course of the 6 months on that one occasion that I played you the clip from earlier on. But you still heard from him nonetheless, and you felt the effects of some of the policies and changes that he tried to put in, including some cost-cutting things. And while the company needed a lot of these things, a lot of these changes, sets of fresh eyes to look at things based on the situation and where the company was at that time, sometimes there's a method to the madness and a madness to the method, and in neither case were those things needed at this time. What the company really needed was a leader and a model and somebody that everybody could get behind and rally behind. And in this case, this man just wasn't it. Obviously, it only lasted 6 months, and he was out come about Christmas time. So before we go, friends, let me show you the trailer for Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier, Part 2, coming soon.
Julius and Rose Meltzer went forward with the belief that their son's death was an accident, and this setback rocked the family during a time when brother A.L. and Herman's Evans Furriers was skyrocketing to the top of the industry.
Those Meltzer kids obviously weren't taught how to cope or how to parent or relationship skills were really lacking, and that got passed down.
All I know is that he had a photographic memory. He was brilliant, and the family loved him.
Yeah, I think she loved the way I looked, so she was always, like I was her little doll.
All of his grandchildren wrote reports on Nuremberg at some point in school. Someone would always have an assignment, interview some relative about something.
Nonchalantly would toss a question out, and the beads of sweat were pouring off as he's trying to answer Uncle Bernie's question.
A lot of people live in fear that, oh my God, is that going to happen to me?
In the end, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of customers got hurt. It was just a bad thing.
He's with this dinosaur, toy dinosaur on the table, and he says, what happened to these dinosaurs?
It was a very unique era.
Jeff and I got some calls, and people were just sobbing.
Well, they shut the doors on people. That was pretty high profile.
A fish has got to swim and an eagle's got to soar. That's their natural temperament and how they want to live and how they want to play. And when that's blocked, people are really unhappy.
And that will do today's deep dive and look into the 6 months that shook the Evans Fur Company, the Leonard Levey experience, as I call it, on the podcast here in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier, Part 2. I'm Scott. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you all again real soon. Can't wait to reconvene and do our next dig-in to the people, places, things, and events of the Evans Fur Company between 1929 and its final demise in 1999. Have a great day. We'll see you again real soon.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier, Part 2.
Today, I have a really special treat for you.
I was writing things that were like adventurous. Each instrument has a different personality, which adds to the overall story.
What happened?
Well, Scott, after we were at that point and you'd heard the initial thing, our dialogue always affects me too.
This is a magnificent piece of music.
Thanks, Scott. This is the introduction to one of the songs that I gave to you.
You contacted me and you said, I have this one song that I did with a famous rock star.
You write a song, and then sometimes you lose the initial feeling that you had writing the song, if that makes sense.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier, Part 2.